minimize the offense. Forgiveness doesn't pretend the offense never occurred. Neither does it say that it's no big deal, and that's because it was a big deal. Our feelings were hurt. And whenever we minimize the offense, it cheapens what forgiveness really is. You see, as Christians, we come at this really kind of the wrong way. We think to minimize the hurt that we're being more spiritual. But that's furthest from the point here, the truth. Forgiveness is spiritual, not minimizing the offense. God tells us to forgive, but he never says to minimize the offense. Further, we're not helping the person who harmed us by letting them off the hook, if you will. By minimizing the offense, they never will accept responsibility, and it allows them to continue hurting us and others by their actions. So that's not what forgiveness means. You don't minimize the offense. It's still there. It doesn't immediately restore trust. Somehow we think that it does. The Bible says that when someone hurts us, that we are to forgive them. But the Bible doesn't say that trust is to be immediately restored. Forgiving someone doesn't mean that we place ourselves back in harm's way. Trust is earned, and it takes time. For trust to be restored, a quality proven measure needs to take place over an extended period of time for that trust to rebuild. When they commit themselves to that process, they're rebuilding trust. And if you've ever hurt someone, don't expect that trust to be immediate when you ask for forgiveness. Time and again, I've heard it said, I've asked God to forgive me. Why can't they just get over it? They said they forgave me, so why can't things go back to the way they were? Well, that's usually the point. You don't want them to go back to that. This leads me to the third thing that forgiveness doesn't do. It doesn't mean that there won't be changes. A lot of people are reluctant to forgive because they think that when they do, they'll continue to be hurt. But forgiveness doesn't mean that things are going to go back to the way that they were, which is what led to the problem or the offense in the first place. Once harm has been done, things will never return to that normal. I mean, think of it this way. If you lost an arm, life will never be the same. You'll never get back to the normal life that you had with two arms. But instead, there's a different kind of normal. A new normal. A normal life lived with one arm instead of two. Forgiveness isn't allowing things to be the same. Rather, forgiveness is the starting point that will allow for a new beginning. It's a new normal. It's growth. Changing those things that need to. And forgiveness doesn't mean always forgetting. To forgive and forget often seems unrealistic. Forgiveness isn't forgetting the harm that has been done. Rather, it's choosing to no longer remember the offense against them. Catch the difference? And as we look at the value of love, love says it keeps no records of wrong. When someone wrongs us, instead of writing it down to remember it again and again, we need to choose no longer to keep a running record of it. You know what a stamp collector is? Stamp collectors are the personality type that when something happens, it gets written down in a mental note. And when something else happens, it goes down again and again and again. You ever have this fight? Maybe your spouse might be this way, if those who are married, or with someone else. They build up till the point where they can't stand no more. And it comes out with that. If we're truly going to let love instill in us, we've got to learn to not continue that record. We have to let it go. You see, Forgiving isn't about forgetting. Instead, it's about forgiving the way that God has forgiven us. Forgiveness is choosing to love, and in love no longer holding the sin against that person. So how can we learn to experience the freedom that comes through offering forgiveness? That's what we're going to close with here, our time here this morning here. How can we experience that? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that we're imperfect. You know, I always go back to that old, I call it a country song, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. To know me is to love me." Oh, I won't go there. But we have to realize that we are not perfect. We are not God, because He's the only perfect. Whenever we hurt, we tend to lose our perspective about who we are and who they are. We tend to dehumanize them, forgetting that they are human beings just like us, having the same faults that we have. Isn't it amazing how we like grace, but it's so much harder for us to be gracious to others? Ecclesiastes reminds us, "For there is not a man just on earth who does good and does not sin." There isn't a single person here that doesn't blow it. And so we're all in this together, aren't we? We all have intentionally and unintentionally wronged people, and we'll do it again, because no one does good and does not sin. We work at it as we become more like Christ. And further, we need to admit that unforgiveness is sin. We need to admit that our anger and bitterness is a sin that needs to be confessed. 1 John 1:9 reminds us that God is faithful and just to forgive and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. We're not perfect. We are imperfect. And we need to begin to realize and accept that, and so are others. Secondly, we need to relinquish the right to get even. Now I'm meddling. This is hard, isn't it? We relinquish the right. Considering how in our society today, we all have rights. Well, you certainly have the right to. How many times do we say that? Or somebody might say that as, "Well, you certainly have a right to be mad. You should be mad." You know? And then as Christians, we call it righteous anger. Okay? Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. You know? But it's the heart of forgiveness. It's saying that while we have a perfect right to get even, we, catch this, we voluntarily give up that right. Forgiveness also isn't a one-time event. Offering forgiveness is an ongoing process. Now, right before Jesus told the story of the unforgiving servant, Peter asked Jesus how often, this is how it all got started. It says, how often should he forgive someone? Which was the catalyst for this story. And Jesus' reply was 70 times 7. So if your math's good, that means what? We only have to forgive somebody 490 times. So if you've been married for over 30 years in marriage, you probably top that. Okay, just saying. But that's not what Jesus was talking about. We are to forgive an infinite amount of times until the job of forgiveness is done. And when is that? Well, it's when we reach the point that it doesn't eat our guts out every time that we think about it. We have to relinquish our right to do that. It's a choice. It's a choice. Romans 12:19 says, "Dear friends, never avenge yourselves. Leave that to God." Another verse says, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." We're not to avenge ourselves for the wrongs others have done. Instead, we're to release our right to get even. And that's hard in our culture today. And let God settle the score His way, because in the end, God is going to have the last word, not me. Third, we need to respond to evil with good. Jesus said, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." We are to love, do good, bless, and pray for those who hurt us. And this is one of those verses that we don't often like to read, is it? We don't like to remember it because when we've been wronged, we don't want to have to do those things. I gotta love them. I need to do good to them, even though I've been the one that's been hurt. We want those verses more to say, break their teeth in their mouth, O God, which is actually Psalm 58. Or set a wicked man over him, let him be found guilty, let another take his office, let the creditor seize all that he has. And that was also David in the Psalms. Yeah. But what God says is that we are to love, do good, bless and pray for those who hurt us. Our love for others compels us to give up our right and to respond not with evil, but with good. I don't know how many times I've heard in the workplace, well, I have a right, or she doesn't have a right to do that. You know, can someone do some adulting? I don't know. God says, respond to evil with good. And fourthly, we need to refocus on God's plan. Instead of focusing on the offense or the person that has offended us, we need to refocus on God's purpose for our lives, which is always greater than the pain or problem that we've been experiencing. You know, as long as we continue to focus on that person who hurt us, then we're allowing that person to control us. And if we don't release that person through forgiveness, then we're going to end up resembling them. Remember our series on the path? The direction that we go, and we end up in a direction we don't want to be, that would be the resentment path. It's a law of life. We become exactly what we focus on. We go the direction where we focus on, remember? And think about it. Whenever we say, I'll never be like so-and-so, or how many of you ever said, I'll never be like my parents? But yet, don't you look in the mirror sometimes, or you hear the voice, and it's coming out of your mouth, and become exactly like them in those areas? Job, who had every reason to be offended and to have resentment, gives us 3 steps for refocusing our lives back onto God after the offenses occurred. He says, put your heart right. Reach out to God when God, then face the world again, firm and courageous. Then all your troubles will be fade from memory, like floods that are past and remembered no more. We need to put our hearts right with God. That's where it starts with. Which means that we need to release and forgive the person who hurts us. Jesus said, the good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. If we treasure unforgiveness in our hearts, then what's going to be produced? Sin and evil. But when we get our hearts right with God and forgive, then goodness can flow. Jeremiah said, O Lord, I know the way of man is not in him. It is not man who walks to direct his own steps. We need to face life again after forgiving. You see, to forgive calls for a decision. We choose to forgive.